Maine sea captains carried cargo to faraway places. Oftentimes, they brought their families with them.
The women went to sea on their honeymoon, begat, bore, and reared their children at sea. For women, it was an extremely trying existence. She didn't have another woman to talk to. Her husband was master of the ship. He was Jupiter. She was Juno, and she dare not descend from Olympus to converse with members of the crew. This would have been crossing a caste line.
Girls had it especially bad. They were definitely not allowed to talk to sailors. Sailors were not allowed to talk to them. They lived a very, very restrictive life in some respects. On the other hand, they saw more of the world than anybody else did, any other women on shore, for the most part. So it had its drawbacks, but it had its advantages as well. Children on board would be taught by their mother and sometimes their father their lessons, so they would be getting schooling while they were away. So when they came home, they wouldn't be behind. Oftentimes, they'd actually be ahead of the kids that were left behind.
The women also wrote diaries, or wrote long diary letters to be sent back home when they reached port. And in the case of one woman, whose diaries I've gone through very thoroughly, Maria Higgins Murphy from Bath, she kept a running series of diary letters to send back to her family back in Bath. And she was very apprehensive, very often at sea.
Maria Higgins Murphy wrote of harrowing journeys around Cape Horn in South America.
No one slept that night. Jim was on deck all the time. There, great seas would board the ship 10 feet above her taffrail and ran forward to midship, submerging the decks 5 feet below the rails. This big sea was south and the wind southwest. We would have to shout at each other on deck to be heard. By 4 o'clock Monday morning, it began to moderate. Our second Sunday on the ocean, and we have not made much progress, as you will see. One solid week of head gales and strong winds with big seas. Today, the wind is more in our favor. June and I try to keep occupied so the time will go faster. She does very nice embroidery. We've not seen a vessel, with one exception, since we came around the Cape, so don't know where our companions are.
She kept it up for 4 round trips around Cape Horn, until finally in the last of this series of her diary letters, she said, "I know that James will miss me and the children, but my nerves can't take it anymore. I've got to go home." So she went back to Bath. She went back to sea later, of course, but this is real courage. This is real courage, to stick with something that had you on the edge of nerves for extended periods of time, and do it time after time, because it was expected. It was something the sailor's wife had to do, to be with her husband, give him a family life at sea. There were so many families up and down the coast of Maine going to sea that it was not unusual for a Maine-owned vessel to pull into Callao in South America, or Shanghai, or Hong Kong, or Melbourne, or Rio, or somewhere like that, and find 3, 4, 6, a dozen Maine ships there. And they would have Old Home Week. They'd alternate evenings, they'd go to different ships for dinner. Might make a party and go into town and take in a show or an opera, or to go on a picnic, or take a train ride somewhere.
And sometimes, ships would meet in the middle of the ocean, and the captains' families would get together. Life for the sailors was different. They went to sea without their families, and many hoped to one day become captains themselves.
Sailors were often folks that needed to work, you know. They needed a job, and many of them went because it seemed like an adventurous thing to do. They did everything on board. I mean, they climbed clear to the top of the mast to adjust the sails, even in the worst weather. They often only had one change of clothes with them, so if they got wet, they stayed wet until after a storm. Living conditions were pretty minimal. They lived all together in one cabin with many bunks.
If you look at the crew lists of these ships, they're all young men. They're in their teens and early 20s. A few of them are in their 30s, and maybe even find some that are in their 40s. But if you hadn't made it to the quarterdeck, by the time you were in your 30s, you better start looking for another line of work.
They weren't the lowest of the low, but they were not very high up the echelon either, probably. Their families, of course, were always left behind, so families at home may not see their loved ones for years. It could take 2-3 years to go to China and come back again. In the meantime, they had to somehow support themselves at home. Sometimes they'd get an advance on their pay, but not very often enough to keep them going. So they were definitely working class folks.
Another fact of life at sea was death.
The family that sailed together sometimes perished together. It's unusual, of course, for such a catastrophe to take place and wipe out everyone, but it was not unusual at all for a member of the family to die in a foreign port.
There are cemeteries in Maine with headstones memorializing those lost at sea. There are no bodies in these graves, and in many cases, no one knows what happened. The impact of the Civil War combined with the advent of the steamship to bring the Golden Age to a close. Although wooden sailing ships remained a vital component of Maine's coastal economy through World War I, and even experienced a brief revival during World War II, the grand era of shipbuilding began a long, slow decline.
The decline continues to this day. The only shipbuilding industries that continue are building small vessels and building naval vessels. That's true more or less throughout the United States, and it's true in Maine as well. What changed was the focus of the nation. The emphasis changed nationally from being concerned with worldwide trade to being concerned with opening up our own West.
Well, for a while there, New England, of course, was the cradle of ships, and Maine stayed in the business of building large wooden vessels longer than anywhere else in the country.
We were a little bit slow in changing from wooden shipbuilding to steel shipbuilding. It did happen, but not in a big way. We were pretty far from the centers of steel production in this country. So Maine shipyards tended to stick with wooden construction into the 1920s, long after it actually had been abandoned in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So essentially we got left behind by the shipbuilding industry. What took its place on the Maine coast was largely the tourist industry. There started to be a change in the way people lived their lives. People started to take advantage of leisure time. It became socially acceptable to take vacations. It became economically feasible for many people in different classes, essentially the upper classes and the business classes and middle classes were all able to have leisure time.
100 years ago, when in the advent of the steamship, people from the cities decided, gee, they could come up to Maine and get away from the city for a while and visit and go back home again. But what they needed was a reliable source of transportation. Roads were terrible, but the water was a great way to transport people. When steam engines came along, they could keep a schedule. If you're out sailing in a sailing ship and you're trying to get to Bar Harbor by 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning and the wind dies, you're not going to make it. But if you have a steam engine, you could be assured of getting there a lot closer to schedule, which meant they could also get back home and get to work again on schedule, which they liked. So that brought a lot of people up here to visit and started our whole tourism industry, which of course still goes today.
The beauty of the sea continues to attract visitors from around the world. And although coastal tourism has become a major industry in Maine, there are still many people who make their living in more traditional ways, by boat building, shipping, or fishing and lobstering. The Stevens and Brewer families carry on a unique heritage that began hundreds of years ago.
To me, the Maine coast it's a symbol of being an individual. It's rocky and rugged like life is. It's a great place to raise your children without worry. I don't think I'd want to live any other place.
Production of Home, The Story of Maine, is made possible in part through a television demonstration grant from Rural Development.